Hey there! Have you ever played a game that challenged you to stay human? I think I failed. Anyway, a while ago, I was browsing the Steam store, as you do, and I came across a game I'd never heard of called NeoCab. The store page promised a visual novel about emotional survival in an automated world. Now, I'm not usually a visual novel kind of person. I tend to prefer games with a little more action. But the premise seemed interesting, and I'm a sucker for a good cyberpunk story, so I decided to give NeoCab a shot. The first thing you're probably going to notice about this game is that it doesn't exactly have the groundbreaking graphics of Final Fantasy. But visual novels tend to be a lot more focused on story and character than mind-blowing cinematics. NeoCab's budget definitely shows on screen, but I think the developers did a pretty good job with the game's aesthetics despite the obvious financial constraints. The game has a sort of vaporwave color scheme, and most of the characters wear luminescent clothing and accessories that help to make the visuals pop. I realize not everybody likes the vaporwave aesthetic, but personally, I dug it. The premise of NeoCab is pretty simple. It opens with the game's protagonist, a cab driver named Lena, arriving in the city of LO, a futuristic cyberpunk version of Los Angeles. Lena is supposed to be moving in with her estranged best friend, Savvy. But shortly after the pair reconnect, Savvy sends Lena a disturbing text and then disappears. Now homeless, Lena spends the remainder of the game trying to solve the mystery of what happened to her friend. As the player, you drive around LO exploring the city and getting to know the people who live there, all the while trying to learn more about Savvy's life in LO and determine her whereabouts. Now you may be thinking that's all well and good, but what does any of this have to do with mental health or narcissism? This is actually one of the coolest parts of the game. When the two first meet up, Savvy gives Lena a device called a feel grid. Part mood ring, part science fiction magic, the feel grid is a snappy accessory that can tell what the wearer is feeling by reading their body's chemical signal. The feel grid then displays a color that corresponds to the wearer's emotional state. Anger is red, sadness is blue, happiness is yellow, and so on. Savvy is also wearing the feel grid when the two meet up, and an interesting little scene unfolds as the pair discuss a fight they had the year previous, and their feel grids light up to reveal how their memories are affecting their emotions. I gotta say, I really like the idea of the feel grid, and I wish it was real. I might not necessarily be comfortable wearing it in public, but it would be a pretty cool thing to have. And I imagine it would be pretty useful during times when you're not sure what you're feeling. Let's be real though. If these things actually existed, it would only take about 5 minutes for people to start tampering with them. In the end, it would probably just turn into another filter for a lot of people. Not to be pessimistic or anything. Anyway, the feel grid is important because part of NeoCab's strategy is balancing Lena's emotional well-being with the constant quest for that 5-star rating on the job. If her emotions become too extreme on any end of the spectrum, she'll start losing control of herself. As a result, certain dialogue options will start disappearing based on the extremity of Lena's mood. She might become too angry to give a certain response, or she might become so mellowed out that she'll want to keep riding her good mood and won't dig into a contentious topic that might help her gain important information. And all of this works together to make NeoCab far more than just a sucking up simulator. Every time a new passenger, or heck, even an old passenger, gets into Lena's car, you have to be careful to gauge their mood and needs, while also remembering not to neglect Lena. Sometimes the best thing to do is to be the bigger man, so to speak, and put up with an annoying passenger, while at other times the best call is to have Lena put her foot down and assert herself. There are times when it can pay to take the risk of insulting a passenger, and other times when humoring them is the best way to go. Regardless of the situation, the game is at its funnest when Lena manages to make a genuine connection with a passenger. And since you can pick up each passenger multiple times throughout the game, you get the opportunity to follow them from one night to the next, learning more about them and each of their unique stories. There are times when the dialogue can feel clunky, but more often than not, the game does a pretty good job of using these encounters with passengers to establish character, while also delivering exposition about the game's world in a smooth and natural way. Speaking of establishing character, let's touch on the game's protagonist. I found Lena to be a pretty likable character, which is a good thing considering how much of the game is focused on her emotion. She has a kind of down-to-earth, girl-next-door quality that makes her relatable, as well as a disarmingly goofy sense of humor that got more than a few chuckles out of me. We of course learn a lot about Lena through her various interactions with other characters in the game, and NeoCab also provides a decent amount of characterization through Lena's dialogue options. These options give us a constant peek into not only the things that Lena says, but also the things she considers saying too. At times, she'll consider telling a joke, or she might think about lying to pretend that she's more hip on makeup or current events than she actually is. What she says is mostly up to the player, but just seeing the sorts of responses that she thinks about giving provides an interesting and often entertaining window into how Lena's mind works. In my opinion, NeoCab manages to strike a pretty effective balance between keeping Lena's character consistent and allowing the player's choices to affect the plot and certain gameplay elements. I should mention that there's a pretty strong political backdrop to the story that might turn some people off of NeoCab. A lot of the time, people play video games to escape the stresses and troubles of everyday life, so a game with this many political overtones will probably stress some people out. But for those who like a little politics in your science fiction stories, I think you'll find that this game manages to frame its issues in a uniquely compassionate and nuanced way. And this actually ties into one of the main themes of NeoCab, which is humanity. The ongoing challenge that the game presents the player is to continue seeing the humanity of each of the characters Lena encounters, regardless of how flawed and problematic they may be. NeoCab achieves this, partly by placing cars at the center of the game's politics. Yes, cars. As I mentioned before, NeoCab is set in a fictional, futuristic version of Los Angeles, and the game developer's vision of the city is sort of like if Apple and Tesla were to merge and then create a citywide network of successfully self-driving vehicles. When Lena first arrives in LO, she quickly discovers that she's the only human driver on the road. And this is important for a couple of reasons. The first is that Lena's role as a human driver turns out to be far more controversial than she expected. That's because in this universe, all cars are electric, meaning that issues like fossil fuels and climate change aren't as prominent as they are in the real world. Instead, the characters in NeoCab see cars more like guns. Their main objection to cars isn't pollution, but safety. As a result, some of them are anti-car completely. Others are comfortable with the idea of automated self-driving cars, but not with flawed human drivers. Still others have no problem with cars at all and don't care much whether or not they have a human behind the wheel. As you can probably imagine, this dynamic can make for some pretty interesting rides. The second reason why it's important that Lena is the only human driver in the city is that some passengers specifically use her car service because they want a human driver. At times, they simply prefer to give their money to a human being rather than a megacorporation that makes self-driving vehicles. But more often than not, they'll have a strange request to make, or will want Lena's opinion on something, or will even try to scam her. In short, they're seeking the kind of encounter that an artificial intelligence can't give them. As you might have guessed, NeoCab is very much a character-driven story. No pun intended. There's a minor resource management system where you have to balance Lena's cash with her fuel and other expenses, but it's pretty rudimentary and isn't really the focus of the game. The far more interesting and challenging part of the game is exploring the different conversations available with Lena's passengers and trying to keep that 5-star rating. Each passenger that Lena picks up has their own story, existing in their own little world with their own troubles and triumphs. After each ride is finished, the passenger will rate you on the NeoCab app depending on how the ride went. And as I've mentioned, retaining a 5-star rating isn't as simple as just sucking up to the NPC. The one thing that all of Lena's passengers have in common is that they're yearning for some form of genuine human connection, be it with a romantic partner, a social movement, or a NeoCab driver. A good example of all of this is Siona. When you first pick her up, she's quiet and kind of cagey, but it isn't long before she starts asking Lena what she thinks of her makeup and overall look. Fiona's obviously very self-conscious and quickly reveals that she's on her way to meet her online boyfriend in real life for the first time. She tells Lena that she specifically took a Neo cab rather than a self-driving Capra car because she wanted to get an opinion on her outfit. Fiona confesses that her boyfriend has never seen her without her filters on social media, so she spent hours piling on the makeup as a kind of filter in real life. As the ride progresses, she starts opening up to Lena about her unlucky past with men, mentioning how hard it is to arrive on a first date, only to see disappointment on the guy's face when he first lays eyes on her. She also discusses how difficult she finds being single and how she feels like she's aging and time is running out for her. Fiona becomes very open and vulnerable, and there are a lot of little details peppered throughout the dialogue that make her situation feel real. One of the most interesting things about Fiona is that while you can't help pitying her and wishing she dropped the filters and the makeup, you can also understand how she's become so dependent on them. She reveals to Lena that she never intended to deceive her boyfriend with her online filters, but that she had used them all over social media before the two met, and once he'd gotten used to seeing her with them on, Fiona didn't have the courage to turn them off. She even states explicitly that she's using very expensive makeup to imitate the look her filters gave her. And this kind of fraught relationship between people and the products and services they rely on, capitalism, I guess you could say, is a running theme throughout the game. NeoCab doesn't hold back on its criticism of big tech and other corporate giants, but it also does a pretty effective job of highlighting how and why the average person comes to rely on these huge companies. In fact, it's built right into the gameplay. NeoCab takes place over the span of about a week, and each night Lena has to find a place to sleep. Since money is usually pretty tight, or at least it was for me, the only places I could afford to stay were Capra capsules. I haven't really said much about Capra, and I won't get too into it for the sake of spoilers, but basically, Capra is the Shinra electric power company of the NeoCab universe. They are the Apple/Tesla I mentioned earlier. The game is very clear on the fact that Capra is an extremely unethical company, and that Lena has a personal past with it and a good reason to hate everything about it. But even so, those Capra capsules are often the only thing standing between Lena and a night sleeping in her car. So, while the game makes no bones about its criticisms of capitalism and big tech in particular, it also does a good job of acknowledging how companies like Capra are able to weave themselves into consumers' lives. There's no question of Capra and other similar companies providing value, or at least perceived value. In Fiona's case, her filters and makeup give her something to hide behind. In Lena's case, the Capra capsules provide her with an affordable place to sleep, even if she hates the company. It's sort of like Walmart or Shein in real life. A lot of people might despise how these companies operate, but at the end of the day, these same people might not be able to afford to shop anywhere else. A person might not want to support sweatshop labor or provide money to a country with horrible human rights issues. But a lot of the time, the solution isn't as simple as just, say, refusing to buy something made in China. Ethical consumption can be a confusing and nuanced issue, and I'm glad that NeoCab doesn't try to oversimplify it. One more example I'd like to give here is Merrick. During one of Lena's rides with him, Merrick mentions that he and his friend are on their way to Capra's newest product launch. When Lena asks what product is launching, he tells her that no one knows because Capra is intentionally keeping it secret. No one knows what the product will be until it's unveiled the next night. Now, I have to confess, I've never been the sort of person who needs to have the newest iPhone or the latest tech gadget. So I've never really understood what drives people to do something like standing in line for a new Apple product. But the way that Merrick explains it kind of gave me a new perspective on people who do. I won't get too into it for the sake of spoilers, but I wanted to bring this interaction up because unlike most of the game's characters, Merrick is actually a fan of Capra. When he sees the company's products, he doesn't think about Capra's terrible business practices. Instead, he thinks about the historical impact that the company's products have and the ways in which those products have the potential to change an entire society. This encounter with Merrick is similar to Lena's first ride in the game with a character named Liam. In this interaction, Liam tells Lena that he's planning to take a picture of a famous building owned by Capra. This initially gets Lena pretty angry, but Liam explains to her that despite hating how Capra operates, he just wants to leave the politics at the door for once and be a tourist taking some pictures of a nice building. Liam and Merrick obviously have some pretty different opinions about Capra, but both are able to find at least a little beauty in the company's impact on the world. And Lena's interactions with the two help to shape the complex picture of consumerism that NeoCab sets out to paint. Until now, I've avoided giving away spoilers, but that's about to end. So before I head into spoiler territory, the last thing I'll say is that this game's final boss, for lack of a better term, is basically a very long dialogue sequence that draws on various decisions you've made during your playthrough. Essentially, you have to have a verbal sparring match with a narcissist. It's an intense scene, and a pretty unique way of bringing the story to its conclusion. I also should mention that NeoCab has multiple endings, which is a pretty standard feature of visual novel. And one thing I like about this game is that the impacts of your decisions are pretty logical, particularly when you start approaching the endgame. NeoCab isn't the sort of game that's going to give you a bad ending just because you chose to eat an apple instead of an orange in Chapter 1, for example. This game doesn't pull any tricks. When you're presented with an option, you'll usually have a decent sense of what the consequences are going to be. And I know that comparing a visual novel to a choose-your-own-adventure story is pretty much the most cliché thing you can do. But for some games, the comparison just fits. That was my experience with NeoCab. I had fun going for the different endings, reloading rides with passengers to see the different ways their conversations would turn out, and even doing multiple playthroughs so I could pick up passengers that I hadn't had the chance to interact with during my first game. So, if you've gotten this far and you feel like NeoCab appeals to you, I'd recommend turning the video off and giving it a try. Now let's get into the spoilers. Alright, so as I mentioned earlier, the game's plot revolves around the mystery of what happened to Lena's best friend, Savvy. For a little context, Lena and Savvy have been friends since high school, but roughly a year before the start of the game, the two had a massive fight and haven't spoken since. Then out of the blue, Savvy calls Lena up and asks her to move in with her in LO. When the game begins, Lena is eagerly anticipating the move while also feeling guilty about her part in the fight. This is important. When Savvy first appears on screen, something about the interaction feels a little off right from the get-go. In one breath, she gushes on and on about how much she loves Lena, drowning her in compliments and even giving her the feel grid, which presumably isn't cheap. But in the next breath, she starts making remarks about how emotionally volatile Lena is, and she even goes so far as to tell Lena, more or less, that she's giving her the feel grid so that Lena can keep her irrational emotions under control. Savvy even mentions the fight that the two had and implies that Lena's emotional instability was the cause. The reason I'm going into so much detail about this exchange is that this first meeting with Savvy and the setup to it pretty much set the tone for every interaction between these two characters for the rest of the game. Savvy's pattern is that she'll go radio silent, then pop up again without explanation a day or two later, pouring on the compliments and asking for a favor out of the blue. If Lena expresses frustration over Savvy's disappearing acts, or even just concern for Savvy's safety, Savvy responds by calling Lena over-emotional, or generally behaving as though Lena is overreacting. You might think this sounds like gaslighting, and that's because it is. Anytime Lena so much as expresses an emotion, Savvy makes her out to be a minefield of hysteria. To make matters worse, Savvy is constantly using love-bombing tactics to distract from how she treats Lena. Just when you're starting to get fed up with her, she'll pull out some memory from her and Lena's high school days, or she'll start gushing about how much she loves and needs Lena. It's extremely manipulative, and all of this leads up to the game's final confrontation. When at last you find Savvy, you've already uncovered a few key points about the mystery of her disappearance. By now, you know that the reason Savvy disappeared is that she managed to steal some very important files from Capra HQ, but that the company caught wind of what she did. Knowing that Capra was on her tail, Savvy hid the files that she stole in the field grid she gave to Lena before going into hiding. Let me repeat, Savvy planted all of the evidence of her crime on Lena, without bothering to tell Lena what she was up to. To make matters worse, Savvy also installed some kind of spyware on the field grid so that she could keep an eye on the files, or near in this case, which means that she's been listening in on everything that Lena's gone through pretty much since Lena's arrival in LO. So not only did Savvy plant the files on Lena, placing her in direct danger of LO's crooked cops, but she's also been listening in on every one of Lena's conversations. She's heard Lena talk about how worried she is for Savvy, and how she doesn't know if her best friend is alive or dead, and through all of it, Savvy never bothers to let Lena know that she's all right. Not until she wants something from her, of course. The cherry on top of this extremely toxic sundae is that when Savvy finally has what she wants, that is, when Lena gives her back the stolen files, we learn that Savvy doesn't even know what the files contain. She stole them, assuming that Capra was hiding something big, but actually had no evidence to support her theory. When I first started playing NeoCab, I obviously had no idea where the story was going to go. But let me tell you, I was done with Savvy and her antics pretty early on. My greatest fear as the story progressed was that by the time the mystery of Savvy's disappearance was solved, the game would find some kind of outlandish justification for her actions, or just generally sweep them under the rug. But fortunately, the writing in this game is too good for that. When you finally meet up with Savvy, a long dialogue sequence starts, and this is the final boss battle I mentioned before. During this exchange, Savvy uses every weapon in her arsenal to manipulate Lena. She starts with the love bombing and the excuses, and when these don't work, she goes on the offensive, flipping suddenly from her sweet talk to insults and accusation. She calls Lena selfish and starts listing off a long record that she's obviously been keeping of Lena's shortcomings, trying to guilt her into backing down. When this tactic doesn't work, her personality flips once again, and she starts crying and trying to play the victim. This dialogue sequence feels like it lasts 18 years, to the point that it becomes exhausting. And interestingly, right when I started to feel this way, Lena's dialogue options started to reveal that she was also becoming tired of it all. But if you press on and hold her feet to the fire, Savvy will eventually run out of dirty tactics and will have to face the truth. One of the best parts of this scene is the way it incorporates the feel grid. As I mentioned before, when you start nearing the end of your battle with Savvy, she'll start to cry. She tries to play the wounded victim, and Lena almost falls for it. But when she notices that the emotions Savvy is displaying don't match her feel grid, she manages to figure out that Savvy's only trying to manipulate her. And let me tell you, when Lena finally grows a spine and stands up to Savvy, it's very satisfying. What happens next is largely up to the player. You can decide to help Savvy sabotage Capra. You can sabotage them on your own, or you can choose to smash the field grid and destroy all of the evidence that Savvy worked so hard to collect. Once the Capra situation is dealt with, you then have the choice to either allow Savvy back into your life or cut ties with her completely. Regardless of what you decide to do, the game ends with you taking one final ride, this time out of LO. And that's all I really have to say about NeoCab. If you played this game, I'd love to know what you thought of it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more if you enjoyed this video. And thanks for watching. See you next time.